Um, Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge was really difficult to build owing to the fact that a lot of the workers who built the bridge had to work deep under the water, but in pressurized conditions. And the human body, when you work under that kind of pressure, basically what they were doing, they were laying the foundation blocks that would be used to support the structure of the bridge. And the Hudson River was about at least 50 foot deep at that point. So when they came to the surface, they would experience what's called the bends. It killed some of them. The bends are very painful. Basically, the bends is where your blood forms air bubbles. And it makes it really painful to bend your joints. That's why it's called the bends. Immigrant workers did a lot of the work. They would work for a few days and then quit. Thanks to these bad working conditions, workers all across America formed unions, demanded shorter hours and better pay. And eventually they got it. But the story of the conflict between labor and management, I had an 8th grade teacher, it's like a pendulum on a clock. Sometimes when management becomes really bad, the pendulum swings toward labor. When labor becomes corrupt, the pendulum will swing back toward management. And the tide and ebb and flow of opinion will go back and forth because both sides will make mistakes in their dealings with each other. Who built the cities? In a lot of cases it was foreigners and the very, very poor. Chicago was one of the fastest growing cities in the country thanks to the meat industry and the distribution warehouses also. The word slum became a part of the American vocabulary. The rich and poor, the gap between them widened. There was a saying, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And sometimes there's some truth in that, folk. Foreigners would go to the big city ghettos. The ghetto is just like another word for slum. A place where people, the word ghetto does not always mean slum. It means where people of one ethnic group lives, whether it be black people live in one area or Polish people or Jews all would settle in one area of the city. And sometimes they wouldn't even learn to speak English. There would be an Italian ghetto where Italian was spoken. But of course, eventually, English made its way into these places because it had to. The move from rural to urban was a worldwide phenomenon as Europe was industrializing. Now there was a third world. The third world remained a lot as it had been for millennia. We're behind and backward. Andrew Carnegie, he at first hired low-wage American boys, but then he wound up hiring low-wage immigrant boys. Most immigrants in those days came from Europe. However, in other words, at the first, your immigrants came from Great Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia. But in the late 1800s, more and more immigrants began coming from Italy and from these places in Europe, Croatia, Yugoslavia, and places, and Russia too, particularly Russia. Places inhabited by the Slavic people, and the Slavic people were generally looked down on. By the way, the word slave comes from the word Slav. Adolf Hitler especially looked down on the Slavic people and believed it was the duty of his group to take their lands. And of course we know that Hitler lost. Most European immigrants settled in North America. That includes Mexico, Central America, and the islands, and Canada and the United States. But again, most of the immigrants, 70%, settled in North America, but South America received a lot of European immigrants also. Not quite as many as North America did. Tickets on some ships could be bought for as little as $25, which was cheap even in those days. Now, today, most people who cross the ocean do so on a plane, and if any of you know more about this than I do, my understanding is that plane tickets are cheaper than ship fare. I've been to Europe twice, and both times I flew across the ocean. The flight takes 8 hours. You generally get served one meal during the flight. But anyway, in those days, they had to travel by ship. The airplane did not yet exist. America was advertised to be better than it actually was. Russians came over to avoid service in the Tsar's army. The Tsar of Russia, the Tsars in those days fought against everyone. Nearly everyone anyway. Most of the immigrants were young men. And oftentimes the men came by themselves. When the women came, they came as wives to the men or as daughters to the men. So there were some women who came, but if they came individually, they were mostly men. Very few unmarried women came, or very few women came by themselves. Now, the word pogrom here is always used in the context of Jews. It means basically persecution of Jews. There were pogroms in Russia and in Poland, and a lot of Jews came. Now, the Jews were hated, and a lot of Jews they've been kicked out of, well, I mean, here I'll tell you, essentially what had happened. England kicked all the Jews out. Spain and Portugal kicked the Jews out. Eventually France made the Jews living so bad, so the Jews tended to move toward Poland and Germany. This part of Europe. Now, several of them moved into Russia, but they tend to move towards Germany and Poland. And basically, they were setting themselves up for the Holocaust that came in the 1940s. Moving to this place where eventually they were to be sent to gas chambers and put in ovens and slaughtered. Now, I want to say this about the communists. When the communists took over Russia in 1917, they never carried on a program of anti-Semitism. And Stalin, godless man though he was, Stalin actually voted with Israel in the United Nations, voted to partition Israel and give Israel their part of their homeland in Palestine. But at this point, though, the Tsars of Russia persecuted the Jews heavily. The premiers, the communistic premiers, generally did not. And anyway, when a lot of Jews came over to the United States at this time, and they tended to settle in the east, in coastal cities on the east. And a lot of their descendants are still there. Well, as more and more of this type of people came in, the United States did not seem to object so much to British people coming, because after all, we started out as a British colony. But then they didn't like the Germans, because the Germans drank a lot. I mean, just stating a fact, folk. I mean, I'm partly of German descent myself, but the Germans drank a lot. They didn't like the Germans. The Poles were considered inferior, and yes, I'll say this about the Poles. I don't hear them anymore, but when I was a young man, there were a lot of Polak jokes going around. And one time a Polish man asked an American, "Is it true that the Americans make jokes about us?" The American didn't want to answer, but fine, the American had to tell the truth. "Yes, it is true." And the Polish man said, "Well, we're sorry to hear that, because the Russians do too." I'll say this now in Poles' defense. Some of the smartest people I've ever known have been Polish. I went to high school with a couple of Polish people, the two boys who made straight A's, and the younger one was quarterback of the football team. The football team won 9 games his junior year and lost 1. But some of the smartest people I've known have been Polish, but they made some bad moves in our history and got a bad name. African Americans were treated badly. A lot of them moved north. The Chinese came. Now, I had a Chinese student some years ago want to make sure that I knew that the Chinese helped build our railroads out west. So, yes, I know that. And yes, the Chinese helped build railroads in California and in the western part of the country. But when the railroad building was done, they would do other work that other people would not. They often went to the big cities because they were not allowed to own property. You know, there's discrimination laws. So they went to the big cities and they would do work that most Americans would not do. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and for the first time, a law was passed that excluded immigrants based entirely on race. The Chinese Exclusion Act led to laws to keep Japanese out also, Filipinos. The Japanese resented us for this, and you may know eventually we were to fight a war with Japan, brought on partly by our own policy of excluding the Japanese. France gave the United States a gift. Big Statue of Liberty stands 300 foot tall. It was sent over by ship, not standing up. I mean, it was sent over in pieces, then assembled here. A poem dedicated to immigrants was written about it. Here's what I remember about the poem. Give me your tired, your poor. Give me your, if any of you know more about it. But anyway, a poem was written about the tired and the poor can come over here. But nevertheless, I mean, the Statue of Liberty still stands. Now, about the Statue of Liberty, there came a time when it became rusted and corroded and in a bad state of repair and had to be closed. The United States, I don't know if they used tax money or donated money, but they repaired it and shored it up. For a while, you were able to go up the arm that stands there with the torch. You were able to even get inside the torch. And then they got to where that was considered unsafe. I don't know what the latest is, but I do know it still stands. An immigration restriction bill was passed. President Cleveland vetoed it, but this bill came up again in the 1920s, some 30 years after Cleveland left office, and it placed more restrictions on immigrants. Again, this is a controversial point because it's still an issue. Who we let in. Now, there are a lot of persons, and some of you might feel like this too, that we shouldn't even have any borders. We should just let everybody into the country who wants to come in. I must say, in defense of those who believe otherwise, it was foreigners who brought down the Roman Empire. Rome let these foreigners in, and they wouldn't pay taxes, would not work, would not contribute, and leached off of the Romans. And eventually Rome collapsed under its own weight. Foreigners have destroyed the Chinese at least 3 times in our history, destroyed the Chinese civilization. The Mongolians did once, the Manchurians did another time, and there was another time too where foreigners came in and brought down Chinese civilization. The Chinese recovered. But, so in other words, the issue is just not that simple. The city Jacob Riis wrote an article about how the other half lives, and I want to say this, folk. I was somewhat embarrassed during the morning class. I was talking about the really, really poor people in Los Angeles and San Francisco. I mean the homeless. And some people spoke up and said, we have thousands of homeless people right here in Atlanta. I wasn't as aware of it. And same thing happened at this time period. A lot of your people did not know how the poor people were living. The poor people were living maybe just a little short walk away, and nobody was aware of how poorly they were doing. But Jacob Riis wrote a book about how the other half lives, particularly how the poor lived in the cities. The rich would throw parties that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, decorating for the party, and then the expensive liquors and expensive wines and expensive food they'd bring, and then the expensive clothing they'd wear to the party, and show very much indifference to the poor. And each rich person would try to outdo the other one in how much he spent. A lot like the Roman Empire. In fact, finally Caesar Augustus had to set a limit to the amount of money that the rich could spend on their parties. He enforced the law, but it did very little good in the long run. America's workers, very diverse. At the bottom of the social ladder stood the common laborer. Now, the common laborer was the unskilled laborer, and I've got to elaborate on that a little bit. My 8th grade history teacher, we had a career week where I went to school. My 8th grade teacher warned us, those of you who just want to be common labor factory workers, unskilled labor is going out of style. And folk, I can tell you that to be true. I spent 27 years at Lockheed building airplanes, helping to build airplanes. And the only unskilled laborers I can think that we hired were the janitors, the custodians, and the laundry room people. The laundry room people would go around collecting the rags that people would use to clean airplane parts. Go around collecting the rags and take them to the laundry room, wash the rags, and put clean rags out. That was the lowest level. Well, the janitors were labor grade 1. The laundry room workers were labor grade 2, and you went up to labor grade 3, 4. You had to have a skill in order to get up to labor grade 18, which was the highest. And of course, half the workers there were salaried. Anyway, now, it was a common laborer was at the bottom of the social ladder. Now, a few workers worked year-round. All right. I did some genealogical research. My great-grandfather, William Wallace Cunningham, he could work 6 months out of the year. He was a steel worker, and lived the other 6 months on what he'd earned during the 6 months he was working. He knew he had to, so when he was working, he had to save as much as he could because he knew that the layoff was inevitable. Very few workers worked all the time year-round. The skilled laborers made more money than the common laborers, and folk, this is still true. At Lockheed, every level you went up meant that you got another skill. Now, Lockheed would train you, and a lot of persons who started out even as janitors wound up getting a labor grade 5 or 6 job, and maybe even higher. There was no unemployment insurance. You know, if you get laid off, you can collect for a while. Old age pensions. Yes, I'm drawing one now. But in those days, there wasn't one. That meant you had to work. You could not retire. Workers' compensation, I never collected it, but workers' compensation, if you were hurting a job, you could be compensated. I had a few little minor mishaps on the job, but never bad enough for me to miss work. The threat of ending up in the poorhouse hung over every worker. Yes, they had places called the poorhouse where if you lost your home, you could go and live together and share your food and your bedding, everything else. But the poorhouse was a big fact of life and the threat of going there. Factory workers tried to replace their workers with machines. Yes, this was even going on 100 years ago. But then they found that the machines could not do everything. And one of the things that the machines could not do in those days was decide if a part was good enough to send on down the assembly line if it wasn't. And yes, as part of my job was to decide, I'd make a part, and I had to decide, now, is this good enough? And I'd ask myself, now, would I want to fly in a plane with this part that I just made? If I decided I didn't, I'd scrap it. If I decided, yeah, I think I'd be okay to fly in it. But I asked myself, would I fly in a plane that had this part in it? If I think I'd send it on down the line. Again, machines. Now today we have machines that could make that kind of judgment. In fact, but in those days they didn't have it, so you had to decide. Now this part that was just been made, is it good enough to work or not? Wives and children eventually had to work in a lot of instances. The father's income was not enough. Now, folk, this statement right here is even more true today than it was 120 and 130 years ago. Most women wind up having to work either outside the home or even work in the home. A lot of boys were sent out of the home to find what work they could in the streets, either selling newspapers, selling flowers, selling candy, or whatever. Some of the more educated became managers. Women took over the job of being typewriter. Now, at one time they called a woman who typed a typewriter. Today the word typewriter always means the machine that you type with. And when I hired in at Lockheed, we had thousands of typewriters. And when I left, we still had thousands of them, because the company decided it would be more expensive to try to get rid of them, and nobody wanted them. It could be more expensive to try to get rid of them, to keep them and let us sit there. By now, they might have gotten rid of all of them. The typewriter was replaced by computers. Now, I am a very, very lousy typist myself, but And I used to dream of the word processor when I was in school in 1967, 68, 69, 70, 71. Then I went back in 73 and 74. 75 I graduated. But I was a very lousy typist. And I dreamed, well, in 1979 I bought myself a word processor. It was a computer that's no longer made, a Radio Shack computer. And the word processor was called Scripsit. Likely none of you ever heard of it. But today, I mean, thanks to the word processor, I can type and make it look like I'm a good typist. But if you actually watch me, type about 6 keys, and whoop, make a mistake, go back again. Today, I mean, you know, at one time I had to use erasable bond paper. Every time I said go back and erase and type it over again, I once got an F on a paper. The teacher said, if you strike over, I struck over anyway, hoping the teacher wouldn't notice that the teacher did, and I got it. Probably most of you don't even know what a strike over is. Where you have a bad letter and you go back and strike over it real hard, hoping you'll cover up the bad letter, the wrong letter. That's a strike over. Today, there are no jamming keys. Most of you don't know what jamming keys are, probably. The old typewriters. The electric typewriter, by the way, never did jam. The manual typewriters, you jam them often. Again, some of you looking at me like you don't know what I'm talking about. But anyway, it was found out that most of the time women could type faster than men. The job of being secretary was mostly for men for many generations. Abraham Lincoln, all of his secretaries were men. If you watched a movie about the 1919 baseball scandal, the baseball owners, all their secretaries were men. But eventually, male secretaries were replaced by female secretaries. All right. The Knights of Labor, American Federation of Labor attacked workers. Now this happened to my grandfather during the Depression. He worked during the Depression, but his wages were cut. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which is a large employer, they announced a wage cut. Then they announced another wage cut, but while they were announcing a second wage cut, their shareholders got an increase in the profits. Now, shareholders get to draw dividends. The workers got upset and went on strike. Violence erupted. The strikers resorted to damaging company property. President Rutherford B. Hayes called out the army. Soldiers began doing the work that the workers had done. They served as strike breakers. Eventually the strike was settled, but it terrified management, and they worked hard to stop unions. The Knights of Labor was formed. They were at first a secret lodge. They wanted to unite fragmented peoples. They wanted to unite all workers, male and female, all genders, or both genders, all races, into one organization. Now, this sounds noble, folk. There was a problem with it. The country was not quite ready for that. Eventually, they abandoned secrecy. They were not involved in the Great Railroad Strike that came a little earlier, but their membership increased after the strike. More and more people joined unions. The strikes proved more effective than boycotts. I mean, they tried to boycott, but I mean, boycotts, for the most part, folk, boycotts don't work. There are groups right now who are boycotting Home Depot. For a long time, a lot of people were trying to boycott Disney. Don't work. But anyway, so the strike was a little bit more effective. The Knights of Labor didn't get everybody. Eventually, the steel workers formed their own unions, and that's still true. Now, the aerospace workers are members of the IAMAW. Don't worry about writing that down, but International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, IAMAW. The automobile workers are members of UAW, United Auto Workers. So each of these industries have their own union, still do. The Knights of Labor wanted to represent every worker in the country, just like the AFL and CIO tried to do. It didn't. Well, Samuel Gompers founded the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, and he had a different idea. Just attract the skilled workers because they have more clout than the common workers. But get the skilled workers and you will get management's attention. I mean, there are certain skills, like to put an airplane together, that it takes a long time to train people to do. And there's workers that you just can't do without. Well, unfortunately, Samuel Gompers was a fan of Karl Marx, and he's been called a communist. Gompers, I mean, I know most of you would be trained to say, well, I'm for the Knights of Labor because they tried to take in everybody. Gompers only took the skilled, but Gompers' work was more effective. The AFL is still around. No, that does not mean American Football League. It's American Federation of Labor. All right. Anyway, how much time? I'm running out of time. Now, let me tell you, what I might do is put this morning's lecture online. All right. Haymarket. A bunch of people came on board who were socialists, and socialism is still a big issue. We have one major presidential candidate who is an open socialist and says so. Anyway, the socialists said that radical reform is necessary. They met in Chicago on May 1st. Now, I'll say this about the date May 1st. For many years, May 1st was like Labor Day, but then the communists took over that day also. So our labor people now celebrate Labor Day on the first Monday in September to get away from the communist day. But anyway, they met to push for an 8-hour day. Sounds reasonable enough by our standards. But labor leaders were divided over the issue. They had a peaceful demonstration. Then the strikers attacked scabs. Now, if you look up the word scab in a dictionary, it is like a wound that's in the process of healing. That's one kind of scab. The other kind of scab is a union worker who works during this strike and does not participate in a strike with his fellow workers. We had scabs at Lockheed, and they were hated and shunned and avoided, and it was a life sentence, folk. I participated in 2 strikes, one of them greatly against my will, but I had no desire to become a scab. Anyway, the strikers attacked the scabs. The police opened fire, killed some of the strikers. Again, this was Haymarket. The workers assembled, but the number of strikers went down. A lot of maybe they were afraid, or maybe they just wanted to get back to work. The few strikers that remained, the police wanted to disperse them so everything would get back to normal. But then someone threw a bomb at the police. We don't know to this day who threw it, but several people were executed for the crime. Even though some of the people who were executed might have very well been innocent. The police opened fire. The strikers fought back. Both people on both sides were killed. The public blamed the strikers and the unionists. The Knights of Labor were dead. May 1 became the Day of the Worker, and that was true for many years. The 8-hour day movement was dead. So skilled workers then turned to the AFL, and the skilled workers were generally more intelligent and more restrained, and also more essential to the operation of the firm. They got more than the unskilled workers did. The unskilled workers had to wait 40 years before the CIO would represent them. Now today, the AFL-CIO has joined. It's now the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organization. They have joined into one union. But they hope to get all the workers in the country, but the aerospace workers joined their own union. Well, I'll tell you something about aerospace workers. They're generally a more intelligent bunch than the people who work at the steel mills or whatever. I mean, no offense to the one in the steel mill, but they feel like they're better. I mean, I spent 27 years in an aerospace factory, and most of the workers there are highly skilled and pretty intelligent. I mean, yeah, I heard higher quality conversation than you would among paper mill workers or whatever. All right. Anyway, as time went on, more white women, married white women stayed home. The white men went out to work. Again, this is because of pay increase. A lot of young women worked inside houses as domestic servants, and they were looked down on. They would work for low pay, and also they might be sleeping, and all of a sudden the master says, I need you. They'd have to interrupt their sleep, and oftentimes there's no chance to get back to sleep when the chore was over. Or they would be called on even while they were eating and have to get up from the table and no chance to finish their meal when the work was over. Mill towns. All right. My grandfather lived in a mill town. These mill towns were generally unnamed. They sprung up around the mills. 2 members of the family had to be working at the mill to live there. The company owned the schools, the churches, the stores, and the houses of